Have you ever wondered what your belly button was all about? I mean, have you ever looked down at your stomach and looked at the curious structure there and thought to yourself, I wonder what this is for? Well, maybe some of you have, and some of you know the story behind your belly button. But for those of you who don't, it's actually an interesting one. The story goes all the way back to the time when you were in your mother's womb. And when you were in your mother's womb, you were attached to her. You're attached to her through a structure known as the umbilical cord. Here's our umbilical cord. And you can see that the umbilical cord is attached to your belly button. What is now your belly button? So the belly button is a bit like a historical artifact. It shows where you were once connected to your mother. Isn't that pretty cool? Well, in the rest of this video, we'll be exploring that. Moving on to learning how does the fetus develop inside a mother's womb. So what are the structures supporting the embryo's development? So here are the learning objectives. We're going to learn about the functions of two structures, one called the placenta and also the umbilical cord. And we're also going to learn about the amniotic sac and amniotic fluid. So here is the pages of the textbook that you can refer to as well. Alright, let's start with a quick recap of what happens when a baby is formed. So at first there's fertilization, where the nucleus of the sperm fuses with the nucleus of the egg, and we form a zygote. Right, now the zygote then moves along the oviduct, and it divides repeatedly and forms a ball of cells known as the embryo. The embryo, of course, continues moving on, and when the embryo reaches the uterus, a process called implantation occurs, where the embryo implants itself into the uterine lining. And it is here that the embryo develops, and 10 to 12 weeks later, it becomes known as the fetus. So a big question that comes out of this that we need to answer is, how does the embryo, this developing embryo, how does it get the nutrients that it needs? After all, it's a growing ball of cells. Cells are continually dividing, and the structures are continually being formed, so it needs nutrients. So how does the developing embryo get all the nutrients that it needs? Well, there are a few main structures which help support the embryo's development during pregnancy. And we'll look at those main structures in this diagram here. Now, the first thing to note is that this structure that we're looking at here, this is the uterus. Right? Of course, the uterus here has expanded to allow room for the embryo inside to develop. So the first main structure is called the placenta. Now the placenta is an organ where exchange of substances takes place. So I'm going to circle here. So this entire structure here is the placenta, right? Now the placenta is where the mother's blood system comes into contact with the baby's blood system. And so substances can be exchanged between them. I will look a bit more at that later on. Now the second main structure is the umbilical cord. The umbilical cord connects the embryo to the placenta. Right? So whatever substances that need to, for example, they need to leave the embryo, let's say waste substances like carbon dioxide, it'll go out of the embryo, go into the umbilical cord, and then go into the placenta, where it will then enter the mother's blood and be removed. Okay? Now the third important structure is the amnion, or the amniotic sac. Now this is just a membrane that surrounds the entire embryo. And inside the amniotic sac is a fluid known as the amniotic fluid. And you'll see that there is a fluid that bathes the entire embryo. The embryo is just growing inside this fluid, and it provides cushioning and protection. Now, of course, all these cartoon diagrams look very neat and very pleasant, but they don't quite give us a good idea of what they look like in real life. So I decided to find some pictures for you. Are you ready? Might be a bit squeamish. Here we go. This is a picture of an actual placenta. Over here, you see the placenta. It is a mass of tissue, including blood vessels from both the baby and the mother together. And here is our umbilical cord. Of course, at this point, the baby is already out of the mother, so you don't see the amniotic sac or amniotic fluid. Yes, babies are born like that, and at some point, we need to cut off the umbilical cord. Some people believe that eating the placenta has a lot of health benefits. Not quite scientifically proven, but some people still do it. Alright, let's take a closer look at the placenta first. Now remember that the placenta is an organ where substances are exchanged between the mother's blood system and the baby's blood system. Therefore, the placenta contains both the mother's tissue and also the baby's tissue. Okay, so the placenta, as we see in the diagram here, is made up of, firstly, finger-like embryonic villi. So where are the villi? They're over here. So these finger-like embryonic villi contain fetal blood capillaries. So blood capillaries of the baby's blood system. Now, the other thing that's found in the placenta is also made up of the uterine lining, which contains maternal blood spaces. So this is the mother's blood system. So as you can see here, here is the uterine lining, and here are the blood vessels from the mother. So these are the maternal blood spaces. So the placenta is made up of both baby's blood system and the mother's blood system together. Therefore, exchange of substances can take place between them. Now, the placenta is formed during implantation. So what happens is something like this. Okay, so imagine this is the uterine lining, right? And then this is the embryo going to implant into the uterine lining. What will happen is the embryo will approach the uterine lining, and then the finger-like villi will start to emerge from the embryo, and this finger-like villi will then enter into the uterine lining. It will then implant inside, and that is how this placenta structure is eventually formed. Now this is very important part of your syllabus. You need to know what is the function of the placenta. Right? The structure is not as important, the function is very important. So what happens in the placenta? Here's our diagram. Okay, in the diagram here, you will see the villi. So here's the villi, and inside the villi you will see the fetal blood capillaries. So these are the blood capillaries of the baby. And over here you can see surrounding the fetal blood capillaries are the maternal blood spaces. So this is the mother's blood system, alright, surrounding the villi. So the placenta firstly allows oxygen and dissolved food substances to diffuse from mother's blood to fetus's blood. Right? Because the fetus needs oxygen, the fetus needs food substances. So oxygen and food substances will diffuse from the maternal blood space into the fetal blood capillaries to be carried to the fetus through the umbilical cord. Now on the other hand, the placenta also allows metabolic waste products like urea, like carbon dioxide, to be removed. So these metabolic waste products will diffuse from the fetus's blood capillaries out into the mother's blood. So you can see that here, metabolic waste products will diffuse out of the fetus blood into the maternal blood spaces to be carried away back to the mother's heart, and then of course out of the mother. So this is important because it allows the waste substances to be removed from the fetus into the placenta and then into the mother's system. Now, besides that, the placenta has a few other functions. Firstly, the placenta also allows antibodies from the mother's blood to diffuse into the fetus's blood. So some good antibodies, for example, against German measles, is able to diffuse into the fetus. So the fetus automatically gains some sort of immunity against certain diseases. Secondly, the placenta also continues to produce progesterone throughout pregnancy in order to maintain the uterine lining. Now here's an interesting question to find out more about. I just said that antibodies can diffuse from the mother's blood into the fetus's blood. So, what happens if the fetus and the mother are different blood groups? For example, what if the mother is O blood group, right? Then she would have antibodies against A blood and B blood. Right, and then let's say the fetus is A blood group. Will the mother's antibodies diffuse into the fetus and, I don't know, cause agglutination in the fetus's blood? Well, you can find out more if this is a problem on textbook page 346. So have a read of yourself and find out something interesting for yourself. But for now, we're just going to move on to the umbilical cord. Now, the umbilical cord contains blood vessels. Specifically, it contains 2 umbilical arteries and 1 umbilical vein. In the diagram, you can see it here, 2 umbilical arteries and 1 umbilical vein. Here's the cross section. It looks a bit like a happy face. Very cute. Right, notice that, of course, the arteries have a slightly smaller diameter for their lumen compared to the vein, which has a larger lumen. Now, the artery refers to the fact that the blood is moving away from the fetus heart, and the veins carries blood toward the fetus's heart. So important to know that this artery and vein is with reference to the fetus's heart. So this diagram here shows that again. So here is the placenta. So this area here is the placenta. And you can see that the umbilical artery carries blood away from the fetus to the placenta, and the vein, the umbilical vein, carries blood toward the fetus from the placenta. So what's the function of the umbilical cord? Well, the umbilical arteries will transport deoxygenated blood and metabolic waste products from the fetus to the placenta. Then at the placenta, these metabolic waste products will diffuse from the fetus's blood into the mother's blood. The umbilical veins will transport oxygenated blood and nutrients from the placenta to the fetus. Right? So oxygen and nutrients will diffuse from the mother's blood into the fetus's blood at the placenta. Then the umbilical cord, the umbilical vein in particular, will carry those oxygen and nutrients to the fetus. Right, finally, let's look at the amniotic sac and the amniotic fluid. So if you've ever done some crazy thing like this and stand in a ball, it's a bit like that, you know. That's how a baby feels when it's inside the amniotic sac, which is filled with amniotic fluid. So importantly, the amniotic fluid is there to protect the fetus. It helps to support and cushion it, helps to absorb shock. But of course, because it's a space with some fluid, actually the fetus is able to move around inside the amniotic sac. So the fluid, right, it's not solid, it's fluid so that the fetus can move around. And this allows the fetus to have some form of muscle development. And of course, when during delivery, during labor, when the pregnant woman is delivering the baby, the amniotic sac actually bursts. And the fluid is released and it helps to lubricate the vagina for a smoother process during birth. Alright, so when a pregnant woman says that her water broke, that actually refers to the amniotic sac breaking and the fluid coming out and the baby ready to be delivered. Okay, so that's really all for this video. Just a quick recap of what our objectives were. Make sure that you go away knowing what is the function. Okay, the structure is not so important. More importantly, you need to know the function. Function of the placenta and umbilical cord, and function of the amniotic sac and amniotic fluid. Okay, that's all. I'll see you in the next video. It's our last one on sexually transmitted infections.